The Honourable Member of St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Soon after I was first elected and came to the nation's capital, rookie members of Parliament were called to this chamber, this very esteemed chamber, for a 101 introduction on how Parliament works. A crash course, Mr. Speaker, on how to be a member of Parliament. The analogy, the lesson that I took away that day above all others, Mr. Speaker, was this. Ottawa is the moon, and ridings, including my riding of St. John South Mount Pearl, is planet Earth. Now what I took that to mean, Mr. Speaker, is that Ottawa is not the real world. Ottawa is a bubble. So much of what happens here does not resonate at home. People don't always pay a whole lot of attention, Mr. Speaker, but they do pay some attention. They pay particular attention when what happens here directly impacts them on the ground in the riding, in their living rooms, around the kitchen table, in their pockets. People pay attention to scandal, Mr. Speaker, when well-paid politicians abuse the public trust. They pay attention to a skirmish, especially a colorful skirmish. People like a fighting Newfoundlander. But then there's always a fight for Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. They also pay attention, Mr. Speaker, when politicians who are elected to represent them in these hallowed halls of Parliament make a mockery of Parliament, when they show contempt for Parliament, when they embarrass Parliament. They pay attention, Mr. Speaker, when members of Parliament cross the line. Mr. Speaker, Canadians pay attention when their government sends them into harm's way, into conflict, into Iraq, for example. So when my leader, the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition, stood in this House last week during question period and asked this government to define the military's deployment in Iraq, to confirm that the 30-day Canadian commitment in Iraq will indeed end on October the 4th, he deserved an answer. More importantly, Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserved an answer. But the answer that came from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister was completely off topic. It was irrelevant to the topic at hand, Mr. Speaker. It was insulting. If Ottawa is the moon and my riding is planet Earth, the Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister, the Member of Parliament for Oak Ridges Markham, must be from another planet altogether, Mr. Speaker. Maybe he's from Mars, or some bizarro world called Harpertron. MPs in this House, Canadians, didn't know where the member was coming from, Mr. Speaker. And what was worse, Mr. Speaker, what's rattled this House, what's rattled Canadians, what's rattled people back home in Newfoundland and Labrador, is that the Speaker of the House of Commons apparently has no authority to force the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister to give an answer that's even remotely on topic, that's relevant in any way. There are rules in place to require questions to be relevant to parliamentary business, but not answers. The Honourable Speaker apparently has no authority to judge whether any given answer is, in fact, an answer. The Honourable Speaker can determine when an MP can speak. The Speaker can determine when language is parliamentary or not parliamentary, but he cannot judge the content. And as has been said here today, Mr. Speaker, that's why it's called question period and it's not called answer period. It is in that context, Mr. Speaker, that I stand in support of this motion by the Honourable Opposition House Leader, the Member of Parliament for Burnaby, New Westminster, to improve and enhance question period, to make Parliament more democratic, to force government to be more accountable, to answer simple questions. At the very least, Mr. Speaker, to stay on topic. This motion, if passed, and it likely won't make it to a vote, would give the Speaker the power to cut off a member who persists in irrelevance or repetition. The Speaker can do that already with a speech, but he can't do it with an answer during question period. How relevant were the answers last week by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister on the subject of Iraq? Now, the Telegram, the daily newspaper, my riding of St. John South Mount Pearl, described it as the ever-worsening circus of Parliament Hill. But the quote, Mr. Speaker, that resonated the most with me was from an editorial in the Ottawa Citizen. Quote, "It must make the decent MPs from all parties cringe. If this is what a successful MP looks like now, referring to the Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister, why would anyone even want to go to Parliament, to play that cringeworthy part, to embarrass themselves, their government, and their country over and over again? At some point, It stops being about strategy or even about the rules. This is a fundamental question of honor. End quote, Mr. Speaker. Of honor. Now this brings me to Friday's apology in the House by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, who wept during his apology, Mr. Speaker. But the apology was a little off. At the same time that the member's voice was breaking, was quivering, Mr. Speaker, he was saying that he will probably do it again. And quote, this is a quote from the MP, "I don't think this will be the last time that I'll get up and answer a question that doesn't effectively respond." End quote. Now, I don't want to pick on the MP for Oak Ridge's Markham, the Honourable Secretary to the Prime Minister. He's not the first Conservative lackey for the Prime Minister, and he probably won't be the last. Mr. Speaker, this government's conduct in the House is a direct reflection of the leader, a direct reflection of the leader's consistent contempt for Parliament. This House, the office of the Speaker, must be given the power to override that contempt, a contempt that threatens to rot.
Order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice, rising on point of order.
I've been listening intently to this debate the whole day, and the NDP put this motion, they say, in good faith with bona fides to try to make this place a better place for debate. And yet I just heard that member call the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister a lackey. Doesn't sound like parliamentary language to me, Mr. Speaker, and it's not the kind of thing that's going to promote collegiality in this space. I would ask him to apologize for that remark, Mr. Speaker.
The Parliamentary Secretary knows there is a list of words that have explicitly been identified as non-parliamentary. I don't believe that word actually is on the list. I would again just remind all honourable members to demonstrate a respect for the place and their colleagues and their choice of language. The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week in this House, I posed a question during question period, Mr. Speaker, and the unbelievable happened. It was a first in my time in this House, Mr. Speaker. I raised a question, and I actually got an answer that was on topic. The question was about an extension to the fixed dates for the food fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador to take bad weather into account. Now, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans took to her feet. She responded on topic and agreed to extend the fishery. I was almost floored, Mr. Speaker. I was floored. The crowd on this side of the House applauded the minister's answer and the fact that I got one. Now, people actually paid attention at home, Mr. Speaker, and it played on all the news. The fact that asking a question and getting an answer results in such fanfare, such surprise, tells you that we have a problem, Mr. Speaker. Now, this past weekend, I went back to my riding, and I spent much of yesterday, Sunday, in a small wooden boat, Mr. Speaker, known as a punt. And I was handlining for cod off a place called Petty Harbor. It was as real as it gets, Mr. Speaker. The sea spray, the sun, the sweat, the wind, the taste of salt. Back to my original point, Mr. Speaker. Ottawa is the moon. My riding, St. John South Mount Pearl, is planet Earth. This House must be the high ground in between the moon and Earth. This House should set the bar, should raise the bar, Mr. Speaker, for truth, for accountability, for transparency, and for honor. And too often, the bar under this Conservative government has been lowered. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? L'honorable
The honourable member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to ask my colleague a question. I know there have been a number of speeches over the course of the day, and the Conservatives don't seem to understand something. They think that when it comes to relevance, the Speaker would intervene if there was no connection between question and answer, if the answer was completely off track. In other words, if the Speaker felt that the answer could have been better, but it was on point, then the Speaker would not intervene. As long as the answer is talking about the same thing as the question, there'd be no interference coming from the chair. Same thing as with the adjournment debate. Now, is there some reason why the Conservatives don't understand that straightforward motion on relevance? And does he think it's unfortunate that people found what happened Friday to be so ridiculous? Did he get a sense of that in his riding, the honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl?
Thank you for the question. And I did get a sense of that in my riding this weekend. I think that people in my riding, St. John South Mount Pearl, and right across Newfoundland and Labrador were outraged last week that a question on an issue as important as Iraq, a pointed question from the leader of the opposition, asked directly to this government, and when he asks a question as pointed as that, the response is not on topic. It's about something. He asked a question about Iraq, and the answer is about Israel. When that happened, people paid attention right across the country. And I think, as one of our members on our side of the House mentioned a few moments ago in his answer, I think that the Conservative government have gotten that message loud and clear because their tone today, for example, in question period, was totally different, and they answered questions. So if one good thing has happened, it's that. They're starting to answer questions.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just a question for the member for St. John South Mount Pearl. I heard his speech, and I know we're dealing with a motion on the floor today that is talking about the conduct in question period. I'm assuming he's supporting the motion. I don't know if he gave any justification as to why he thinks we need to do this. I heard about his fishing trip off Petty Harbour, but I didn't hear a lot with regard to this particular motion, and I'd like to ask him why he feels that this motion should be passing on the floor of the House today, and to say to the member that I hope he used better bait and not a jigger when he was down off Petty Harbour.
The honourable member St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Didn't do a whole lot of fishing, actually. Dropped the line once or twice, but it was too windy. Had a great time on the water. In terms of why is it important for an answer to be relevant? My sons asked me about this past weekend, Mr. Speaker. They heard about this in the news. They pay attention to the news. They know that I'm a member of Parliament, so they pay attention to the debate that's going on in this House. And they asked me, they said, Dad, how come when you ask government a question, how come when you ask the Prime Minister or his Secretary a question, how come he can't be made to answer, to force an answer? How come they can't be made to answer a direct question? What I said to them was, they should have to answer. They should. That it should be that way. I tell my sons, tell the truth, be honest, be forthright. And if that's how I want my children to be raised, I think that those principles, which are pretty simple and straightforward, should be upheld in this House as well, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.